Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our webinar entitled Keeping Pace with Energy Efficiency in North America. My name is Scott Ringline, and I am the founder of the Energy Alliance Group of North America, and I will be your host this evening. Before we get started, I just want to thank everyone for attending our first webinar on PACE. This is something we're very passionate about, and we are quite humbled that we have over 70 people that registered for our first webinar, and we had registrations from Dubai to India to Hawaii. So I would really like to thank everyone for your interest in today's topic. Also, for those that attempted to call into the live version of this webinar and had to endure mechanical engineers trying to be IT engineers unsuccessfully, I'm truly sorry for that, but I think each of us have run in that before, especially those that are at machine trials. I actually told my wife tonight that it's interesting that we can take a tin can and send it to Pluto, but we cannot figure out how to provide high-speed internet access to everyone around the world. I'm thinking that would have been helpful today. So tonight, the topics about PACE are going to include what it is and where it's in use at. How does it all work? What the benefits are to the client? Who can use it? Types of uses? And then lastly, some statistics. How is it working? And a case study so you can actually look at some of the numbers. One of the things that we want to share with you first are some statistics from the U.S. in regards to our inability to be more energy efficient. One of the issues that we have is that we have a lot of buildings, like many other nations. We have 5.6 million commercial and industrial businesses. What's even more troubling is that the average age is 50 years old. Now, I know that's young to a lot of our registrants, but in this country, 50-year-old building is pretty old, and everything inside of it is probably 50 years old also. Another staggering statistic is that of the $200 billion that are spent on utilities, 30% of it is wasted on energy efficient or energy inefficient technologies. And most of it is heat, and 9 times out of 10 that heat is not being captured on any type of industrial level. The other thing is that the equipment that is in our buildings, it's aging. It's estimated that over 80% of the lighting and the heating and cooling systems in our buildings were installed before 1986. That alone just tells you how much equipment out there is aged and inefficient. And then, how are we doing from an energy efficient standpoint? Not so well. Of the 16 largest nations out there, we are in 13th place, and that's not really a good place to be. And finally, and this is more important to understand because of our topic, is that a majority of these projects to become more energy efficient don't get approved. And why is it? Well, the thing that we have to deal with are what we call the traditional industrial barriers. These were put in by our forefathers. It's been a model that's been followed for a very, very long time, and coming out of the automotive sector, I'm very used to these barriers. First one, limited capital. Not that there's not money out there. There's a lot of money out there for doing projects. It doesn't fit the financials. That's really one of the biggest drawbacks. The other thing, which ties right back into limited capital, long payback periods. You know, you spend a lot of money on HVAC or industrial equipment, and the term is 5 years, maybe 10 years. A lot of times you'll have an internal target that it has to be paid off in 2 or 3 years. Well, that just doesn't happen, not with large capital, especially on the renewable side. And then finally, one of the biggest issues, this is a legacy issue, is the risk of adoption versus how much savings am I really going to realize. And it's real, we see it every day, but we think that with the PACE approach, these risks are eliminated and the savings are actual savings. And we'll talk more about that. So, what is it that we can use to remove these barriers? Well, that's what we're here to talk about tonight. It's called PACE, Property Assessed Clean Energy Financing. So first of all, what is this? Basically, it's a financing program to be used only for energy efficient improvement projects. So that's all it can be allocated for. It covers 100% of the cost, so there's no down payment, and it covers everybody's cost. But more importantly, the capital comes from a voluntary special property tax assessment. So it's not debt, it's basically a special property tax assessment on the building and property, not on the building owner. And then finally, this model, the PACE model, is actually based on one of the oldest property improvement financing models in the U.S. Now, some of you would be probably thinking, well, what is it? Well, when counties and cities need to do major road upgrades or put in sewer lines, the way it's paid for is they assess everybody on that road or street a special property tax assessment, and it's paid over a long period of time, and it shows up right in your taxes. So that's the model that we're going to talk about, is this property tax assessment that you can take voluntarily, and that's really the credit that's being used to obtain the financing. It is legislation, it's not a federal program, it's a state program, but what I want to caution everybody about is that every state, every county, and every city that is utilizing PACE, there are different rules in regards to savings guarantees and what it can be used on. So one of the things that we'll talk about is where you find this information out. But we're going to talk in very general terms tonight in regards to the model itself. We're not going to get into the specifics state by state. So after the legislation is adopted by the state, then it needs to be adopted, or a PACE district needs to be created in the county or city that the building resides. So even though the state approves it, it doesn't mean that, hey, I can go out and get PACE financing. All the state does is put in a statute that allows cities and counties to actually do the assessment and collect the taxes. So that's really all that legislation does. There's another step in getting it adopted. The value to all of us on the webinar is that you can get long-term fixed rate funding, so we can spread it out a very, very long period of time, up to 25 years. And because you can spread it out longer, it allows the savings to be greater than the cost. Now, I'm not going to say 100% of the time, but a majority of our projects, because you're bundling all of it together, you're not looking at these technologies on an individual basis, as a bundled project and looking at life cycle costs over a 20-25 year period, savings are greater than the cost. Another thing to point out, and this is definitely near and dear to the ops people and those that are writing, capital appropriation requests, is that the financial modeling that's used for PACE is that it also includes the material and labor for repair and maintenance and end-of-life replacement. So we all know a light bulb is not going to burn 24 hours a day for 20 years. So there's going to be an event within that 20 years that all those bulbs will be replaced and that there will be labor incurred to do it. That cost is actually captured. So the savings is actually paying not only the cost of the property tax assessment, but it's also paying for the maintenance over a 20-year period. So that's very different than a traditional model of just debt financing. And then it's repaid through property tax payments. So the structure to collect and distribute is already there. You get your property tax bill. There's an additional line item on there that says PACE special assessment. The check is written by the client to the collection agency, so the city or the county, and they will turn around and then send it to the group that financed it. In some states, that can actually be a direct payment from the client to the financer without going through the county or the city, but they still have to have the district to be able to do that. So where is PACE? Everybody's hearing about it, but a lot of people just don't know where it's at. So it originated in California in 2009 in Berkeley, and believe it or not, it actually originated for use on residential units, not industrial commercial. And that did not last long, but we're not going to go into those details. Today, there are 31 states and the District of Columbia that have adopted it at the state level, but only 14 have adopted it at the local level. So out of the 31, only 14 states are actually active in PACE financing. And it's expanding internationally. So it started in the U.S., Australia has adopted this model, and I'm sure there are other countries that are looking at it. Now, a couple of excellent places to find information about PACE is PACE Now, which is a nonprofit that's located in Washington, D.C. They track pretty much everything about PACE. And then also the Desire website that is funded by the Department of Energy but managed independently. Great websites. With PACE Now, it's just strictly PACE, but with Desire, you can click on the state and look at every incentive that is out there for that particular state, and for a program like PACE, it'll give you some contact information if it's available. So those are some great places to go, and I would encourage you to call PACE Now, and they can tell you where it's active and who to talk to. So why do we want to use PACE? Well, the first thing, it eliminates all the barrier. There's more money than anyone can even imagine out there to do PACE projects. Because of how PACE is structured, ROI is from day one. There is no payback period because from day one the savings is greater than the cost, and that's the financial model that's created and submitted to the financer to finance it. That's really what they're looking at. It's non-recourse. Again, this is an assessment against the building, not against the building owner. And if chosen by their finance group, CPA, whatever, it can be treated as off balance. So that's decisions that have to be made internally. But to give you an example, if you own a building and you do a PACE project and it's going to be financed for 20 years, and in 10 years you outgrow that building or you retire to the Bahamas, the remaining note or the remaining assessment goes with the building. So the next building owner buys it, they continue to pay the property tax because why? their benefit from that improvement made 10 years ago, and that has been consistently maintained through the PACE program. So, you know, although they're taking on this assessment, they're also taking on all of the assets that have been in place for improving energy efficiency. No upfront capital required. It's not like buying a house and you have to have 20% down. And all the costs are included. Long-term financing, you see a lot of people out there promoting 20 years. We do know of some states that will go 25 years. What I encourage everybody to read is not necessarily the legislation at the state level, but the language at the local level, because that's where it's written in regards to how long you can get these projects funded and what are all the mechanics. In some states, and I can talk from Michigan because that's where we have most of our activity right now, is that the statute requires us, project developer, to make sure that it's cash flow positive over the term of the financing. And we'll show you an example of that in a little bit in the case study. But that's why I made the statement up front. It's cash flow positive, positive ROI from day one. And then also in Michigan, any project that's larger than $250,000, there is some type of performance guarantee in place. So again, this is not in use everywhere, and as I stated before, I encourage you to understand statute and the local language. The beauty of PACE is that it can be used multiple times on a single property. So those of us that are in energy efficiency, or those of us that are in capital equipment, we know that in 10 years there will be something better, something more efficient. Well, now, moving forward 10 years, you have the new baseline. You're putting in something that's more energy efficient. So now I have the proposed baseline. As long as that is cash flow positive over whatever term that it gets financed again, it can be adopted. So now you have a second PACE line item on your property taxes to pay for that. So it helps a lot of businesses to expand, grow, replace, become more energy efficient. And as we touched on, the ROI includes the material and the labor for maintenance and end-of-life replacement. That's very, very important for everyone to understand, especially those that are trying to convince the finance group, our CFOs and others, that I'm not going to come back to you in 5 years for another budget request for my maintenance milestone, because it's already included in there. The other point to make, and again, this varies state to state, is that it can cover the purchase of assets that are considered real property, including like electric vehicles. So, for instance, you have a business, you have a bunch of high-lows, they're all electric, you're using solar to charge them, so you're able to show a savings by buying the electric over the gas or the propane. That can be included in PACE. The point about that is although it's mobile, it must stay with the property when the property is sold. So if you move to another building, by statute, you can't necessarily take that asset with you in most states. However, I'm sure that there are workaround plans for such events. So again, check locally. Now, where's the money coming from? Everybody wants to know where the money is coming from. So again, this is state by state, but there are a variety of ways of getting PACE funding. Probably the largest source of PACE funding is through private equity groups. They're managing large pension funds or annuity funds. They're looking for a place to park a large amount of money over a long period of time at a fixed rate. More importantly, that I'll bring up right now, is that if that business goes bankrupt or they default, when the building's sold, the first dollar that comes out, irregardless if it's mortgaged, is property taxes. So that's how the financiers are mitigating their risk on the financing side. Bonds, there's a lot of programs out there where you have to go out and borrow money through bonds. So Toledo, that's one of the models that they use. Believe it or not, most people don't realize this, but Michigan, it is an option to go out for bonds. However, if you have a project that's only $250,000, you're not going to find somebody that's going to buy a bond for that small of project. So what happens is you have to bundle, or you go out and sell bonds, and now you have a pool of money that you work out of. And some of the PACE programs are doing that. That way the projects are not waiting for the funding to come in. Self-funding. This is an important note to make. I sit in so many meetings where business owners that actually do have money but want to take advantage of this financing program, why not pay yourself interest so you can self-fund the projects? Everything else is the same, 20-year term, property tax assessment. It's collected through the property tax process. However, now, if the owner decides to leave or sell, he continues to get that payment. So that's the importance of self-funding. You can go to a bank. There's some local banks here in Michigan that are interested in participating in PACE. However, they don't have an appetite for massive projects in the millions and millions of dollars, nor long term. They're not going to get into a 20-year term. So again, that's just something that you have to understand. Others, well, I can tell you this is that we have meetings with investment groups that maybe are investing money for net value private individuals or private companies. Even they can participate in funding PACE. So now we know where or how it works, where the money's coming from, who actually qualifies for it. Well, the first thing is you have to be in a PACE district. So today I said there's 31 of them in the U.S., Australia. What we can tell you is there's more to come. There's lots of legislation out there, and I'm sure in the future we'll talk more about what's going on. It can be used by for-profit and non-profit businesses. So non-profits like a church, they are allowed in some states to actually take on a special assessment even though they don't pay property taxes. In some states, it can be used for government and publicly owned buildings. So there's some states that are using PACE to upgrade, facilities, road department facilities, and things like that. Next thing is, whatever business you're in, the outlook needs to be pretty good. They're not going to fund somebody that has, a business that's just not doing well. Also, the property can't be leveraged. Now, there are some financiers. Now, this is not necessarily state to state. It's going to be with the financiers, basically how much risk they want to take. There are some financiers that will go up to 95%, but typically the industry standard is 80%. Also, something to point out is that the size of the PACE project can only be a certain percentage of the overall value of the project when it's completed. So you're actually adding investment dollars to your building by replacing all this technology, so the value is going up. Well, of that total value, typically, and again, this varies, you can only borrow 20 to 25% of that value, hence the LTV. And typically in most states, kind of the project sweet spot for starting is $250,000. However, again, they're doing smaller projects. Where we see that working is in the bond areas that have an existing revolving bond fund that basically you're borrowing out of, so they can do smaller projects. The other thing is, if you don't own the building, well, you don't qualify because you're not the owner. However, if the building owner is willing to look into this, you have a good relationship, and they can be educated on this, it's really a huge benefit for them to do this, because typically their tenants are what? Paying the property tax. So they're able to get their building upgraded, but pass on the cost to the tenant. And that's really a win-win, especially when we're looking at renewable projects, because the building itself is going to stay there. They'll always need to give power to their tenants. And with having terms of 20 to 25 years, solar has a much better chance of being approved. So, what projects qualify for PACE? Well, the one thing that we say is it's better to look at the ones that don't necessarily qualify for PACE. Basically, what we tell everyone is that if we can actually calculate the energy savings and show that it's going to be cash flow positive for the term, then most likely it's going to qualify. Some of the projects can actually include new construction. So people would say, well, how the heck is that working? You're not, making it more energy efficient. Well, you are, but it's from a design standpoint. So in every state, county, city, there are local building codes, and then there are actual, the building has to be built to a certain level, like ASHRAE 2007. So that drives a certain technology. For example, they're still using high pressure sodium and metal halide in parking lots. It's a 40-year-old technology, but yet it's cheap. So people are always looking at first expense. For those that look at using PACE, because now you can spread it over a long period of time and it has to be cash flow positive, you can actually offset the cost of the energy efficiency improvement, because PACE will finance the delta. So say you're putting in a metal halide pole and light fixture and it's costing you $5,000, but you upgrade it to an LED fixture and it's costing you $7,000. Now you can finance that $2,000 through PACE, which is allowing you to, one, take on less debt, and two, put more value into your building. So it's going to be worth more. And again, that borrowing that's taking place for this upgrade then goes to the property tax side. Refinancing existing projects. So if there has been a project already done and the purpose of it was to be more energy efficient, they do qualify. Of course, building recommissioning, brownfield sites, major renovations. Again, if we can calculate it, it can be included in most states, and especially for building upgrades. The other one, now this does not qualify in every state, but this can also be applied to process improvements. So, for example, we have a client today that has a large spot weld line for spot welding panels together, and it's, aging equipment. It is not very efficient. So one of the studies we're looking at doing is if we can replace all of the spot welding equipment with much more energy efficient and maybe improve processes. If the savings is there to pay for it, then we can do it. Now again, that has to be considered real property, and it's going to stay with the building upon sale unless there's some other negotiation that's done at the selling time. But I know all of our focus has been on PACE. What we do want to let everybody know about is that there's other places that are affected by PACE that everyone needs to understand. So we kind of talk about the four core approach. The first one is technology. Well, that's kind of a no-brainer. Most of us understand that's where we're really getting the biggest buck for the investment. But also, there's a lot of financing options out there, and there are a lot of PACE financiers out there. Most of them are tied to the treasuries, but it doesn't hurt to understand who can finance in your district. The other thing is all the incentives that come with traditional capital projects, they still apply here. So federal, state, local utilities, they all apply. But more importantly are the tax credits, and not just the renewables, the EPAC, the Section 179. There are some actually engineering-based tax credits out there that can be done at this time. So we encourage people to look at those. Those include, R&M studies, abandonment studies, cost segregation studies. If you don't know about them, get educated on it or find out where someone is actually doing them in your area. The nice thing about these studies, it doesn't take a lot of on-site time. It's more number crunching because it's going basically to the IRS to get a tax credit. Another thing that I wanted to go over really quick here is just the kind of the typical process. Again, every state, county, and city is going to be different, but for the most part, these are some steps that everybody is going to go through. So first thing is, hey, we got to secure a PACE district if I have a client that's not into it. What we will tell you is that those developers out there that want to do PACE projects, trying to go to the county and city to adopt it without a project, you're not going to be as successful as identifying a project and having the client, who is basically the constituent of those that will approve it, they need to go in and actually make the first contact. Conduct a pre-project assessment. Go check out the building, understand ownership structure, all of that. So really do your due diligence up front before you spend any time doing any type of auditing. And also put together a proposal contract that spells out the scope of work. That way the building owner, the CFO, the operation people, they understand exactly what you're going to look at and how it could impact their building. Then you do the audit, and more importantly, what the operational assumptions are. The approach here is to establish assumptions between the operations people, the building owner, because that's who the contract is with, and the developer, because they need it for the financial model. Now we have the data. What are we doing with it? We're doing a life cycle cost analysis, looking at it for, typically 20 years. You can also look at it at 15 years and whatnot. But you have to do the analysis, and you have to look at it from a life cycle side of things, just not the expense. Now you have the numbers. You go out and secure the financing. Typically, you want to have the relationship with the financer and the client and the county or city way up front so that the financer already knows what's going on. They can do some of their due diligence before they ever get your finance package. Execute a performance contract. Again, in the state of Michigan, there's a performance guarantee. So I think there's a lot of other states out there that either do or will follow that model. Get everything installed. Close on the financing. There's an actual closing, so there's a document stack that has to be signed. And then in some states, and again, Michigan requires this in their statute, there is actually an annual audit and reporting event. So looking at energy savings, so looking at all the utilities, but more importantly, looking at the general ledger and seeing if there was any expenses incurred on the maintenance side against the technology that was installed. So, we just covered the program. How is it working? It's been in place since 2010. As you can see, of course, California, that's where most of the activity was because that's where it originated. But shortly after, here we are 5 years later, there's a lot of states that are active, but more importantly, there's a lot of projects. So in just a 5-year period, there's been over 300 projects completed, $123 million of upgrades, and a lot of energy efficiency improvement. And more importantly, especially for those that will be talking to their legislators, their reps, their congressmen, it's creating jobs. Why? Because typically when developers walk into a client's facility, what we're going to propose to them was not even on their radar. So it's not even in their capital. So that means that it's not on their go-to electrician, go-to contractors target for that year. So these are incremental jobs and opportunities. So before we wrap up here, I wanted to go through a case study with everyone. As an engineer, I think it's important to actually show how it's working. So we're going to talk about a Michigan project. It's a auto dealership there. The facility was built in 1969, 1970 era. And although the showroom was brand new because the OEM had required it, the rest of the facility was basically 1969. And it was all original equipment from lighting to doors to heaters. So the scope of the project included replacing all the interior and exterior lighting, replacing all the forced air heaters, replace the compressed air system. There was high-speed doors installed in the service entries. Not all doors were replaced with these, but where the customers' and clients' cars are coming in and out of. And then also improving the building envelope. So replacing seals on doors and adjusting doors. Some of the simpler, cheaper stuff. So this project was a $500,000 project, secured PACE financing. It was a 20-year term at 6.25%. So this is a great time to point out to everyone on the webinar that most will scoff at money that's 6.25%. But what I do challenge those building owners is that to try and get traditional funding for a $500,000 building upgrade, and again, this is equipment, this is not even the building itself, to get that funded for 20 years through traditional methods, it's just not going to happen. So this is definitely a great way to do it. Those that are in the bond world, there are bonds that are cheaper, so there is cheaper money out there. It's just a different mechanism to do these projects. There was no upfront or out-of-pocket costs, so there was no down payments by the client or anything. It was completely financed by the financer. So first thing to point out is that on average, over a 20-year period, there was a $56,000 average annual savings. Now again, this includes not only the utility side of things, but repair, maintenance, and end-of-life replacement. First year ROI. So this is important to show. Why? Because people are like, well, is it cash flow positive? You tell me it has to be cash flow positive. It is 19% first year ROI, almost a $1.2 million lifetime savings. More importantly, is that over the 20-year period, it had a return on investment of 20%. So this was consistent throughout the term of the financing. And then in addition, we filed for and obtained for our client well over $20,000 in utility incentives. So this is a great example to just look at the basic numbers of how everything is working and how it's paid for. So that wraps up our webinar tonight. I, again, would like to thank everybody that is listening to it, and more importantly, those that tried to participate it in early times. And I would also encourage you to reach out if you have any questions. If we don't have the answer, most likely we can, turn you or direct you to somebody that does. And of course, to those that are on the webinar today from Michigan, by all means, drop by and we can talk about what your questions are for the program. The next webinar that we're going to be putting together is entitled Exploring the Path to PACE for Your Energy Efficiency Projects. And again, although it's adopted in 31 states, only 14 of them are active. So one of the things that we'll focus on is, how is it that people like yourselves on the call or the webinar tonight, how can you get PACE moving forward in your locations? So again, I want to thank everybody for listening, and we appreciate your time and look forward to talking to you. Good night.